Hello and welcome to Securing Justice, a housing insecurity podcast series brought to you by the California Center for Ethics and Policy in the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences at Cal Poly Pomona. This project was made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. So please visit calhum.org. Please note that any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed during today's event do not necessarily represent those of California Humanities or the National Endowment for the Humanities. My name is Alex Madba, and as Director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy, or CCEP, and on behalf of the CCEP Faculty Fellows co-organizing Securing Justice, who are Brady Collins, Corey Aragon, and Michael Wu, we are pleased to bring you a panel discussion, Representations of Place, Home, and Security. But first, I'd like to encourage you to visit our website, and I'm putting that link in the chat now. So you can sign up for our mailing list and stay up to date about all future events. We're excited to offer a full lineup of events this spring, so please mark these dates down in your calendar, and we will follow up with more details as soon as we have them. On Wednesday, March 24th, we'll have a panel on housing insecurity, affordable housing, and policy in LA. And on Friday, April 23rd, we will have a panel on redlining, segregation, and wealth accumulation, and we have a couple other events in the works as well. All of these events will be open to the public, so please share our invitations widely. As I mentioned, today's panel will discuss representations of place, home, and security. Los Angeles is home to the largest concentration of unsheltered and unhoused individuals in the country. And in 2020, the situation grew considerably worse. More than half of those that are unhoused are experiencing houselessness for the first time. And we are seeing spikes in unhoused youth and families. That the majority of these individuals did not migrate here from other states or cities, but rather are from Los Angeles County, highlights the tension in the relationship between home and shelter and between place and belonging. This panel brings together artists working in a variety of formats, film, performance, and visual arts, to discuss how their work interrogates this tension through their interactions with the Los Angeles cityscape and its residents. Panelists will discuss how creative practices can challenge social and political structures and how they use representation and narrative to contribute to the discourse on housing insecurity. We have three esteemed panelists today, and you can learn more about them, each of them in the links that I'm pasting in the chat now. First, Marika Splint is a Dutch-French-Tunisian theater maker based in Los Angeles and specializing in creating work in public space, exploring the relationship between people, place, and identity. She serves on the faculty of the Department of Theater at UCLA and is currently developing a new performance, The Biography of a Home, about the history of the housing crisis in Los Angeles, seen through the lens of one address, the century-old home that she currently lives in. Alvaro D. Marquez is a multidisciplinary artist, educator, and researcher who works primarily with printmaking, installation, and sculpture. Their work explores historical and contemporary forms of displacement with special attention to questions around the privatization of land as a commodity and the effects this has on racial geographies and the natural environment. Jeremiah Hammerling is an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker who explores intimate personal stories that shed light on larger issues that affect us all. His work has been featured on CNN, CBS, Vice, PBS, ESPN, and Al Jazeera. Today's panel will be moderated by Rennie Tang, who is Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at Cal Poly Pomona and coordinator of the first-year undergraduate landscape design studio. Her practice-based research includes the investigation of choreographic tools and human movement analysis as methods for landscape, urban, and architectural design. On that note, I'd like to hand the virtual mic over to Dr. Tang.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you to Corwin, Brady, and Michael as well for the invitation and opportunity to have a conversation with these amazing artists today. Before we get started, I would like to let the audience know that there will be a question period at the end, but as we go along, if you have questions, please feel free to type them in the chat as they pop into your head. We will address them either during the conversation or at the end. So let's get started. Jeremiah, Marike, and Alvaro, you are all storytellers, but you all go about your storytelling in very different ways, using different sets of artistic tools. Before I dive into the topic at hand, I'd like to ask each of you to share with the audience a bit about the medium or artistic mode within which you work. For Marike, it's public theater, for Alvaro, it's visual art, and for Jeremiah, it's film. I say this knowing that categorizing your work within this singular disciplinary framework does not do justice to the richness of what you do, but I thought we could use this as a starting point for our conversation. And if you have some visuals to share, feel free to share your screen. I don't know who wants to start. Jeremiah, you turned on your
Oh,
mic, so
I
go
volunteered
ahead.
by unmuting. Hello, everybody. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thank you to everybody for putting this together, for taking the time out of your day to meet up on this Wednesday midday. And yeah, so I also wanted to extend my apologies. Rita, my wife and partner, who I work with often, is also a documentary filmmaker, and who also co-produced City Rising, which is the piece that we will probably talk most about, at least from our angle today. Is unable to be here. She was on another job today, unfortunately, so there's a conflict of interest. But one of the things that I focus on, and that Rita focuses on as well in documentary film, are people's stories. And so at a very basic level, that's kind of our entry point into whatever film we're working on. And we like to think about documentary as there's a lot of different types of films, and we'll get into this later, I'm sure. But for me personally, the types of films that I like to make are essentially intimate ones that come from a personal place, that allow people to access the larger issue from that personal space. And so I like to think of documentary in broad strokes as kind of sort of a way of using curiosity to engage with the larger world. And so we come at the medium, I think, is sometimes open to people wanting to have something that they want to say, and then they want to prove that thesis. That's one way of approaching documentary film. I tend to kind of think of it more as something that starts with a question, and I don't typically like to answer that question. I like to muddy the water so much that the questions keep coming, and that by the end of whatever it is you're watching, that becomes the place from which we want to start a discussion or maybe ask more questions. So that's sometimes a frustrating place for people to think about documentary film. I'm sure not everyone agrees with me, and a lot of people might make different types of films. But I find that that's the most satisfying place to start, and I think it's the easiest place to begin, just by admitting what we don't know and by asking those questions and seeing where they take us. So I think that's a simple way to start. Maybe too simple, but we can kind of go from there and dive in more detail.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Marike, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yes, and I also want to thank you for having me today and for making this interdisciplinary conversation possible. So I'm a theater maker who mostly creates work in public space, and I very consciously choose not to work in conventional venues because for me, the experience of experiencing a performance in a place where you're also a citizen, and there's sort of not that boundary of I'm entering an art space, but it's actually the place that, you know, you could be running to the train, or maybe spending a Sunday afternoon, is very important, because I sort of want to blend the reality of the real world and the experience that people are having. I have some pictures that I can show. I work a lot with sound in public space because I don't really intervene. I see what is happening on the street or in the site that I'm working as sort of a documentary reality that I create a structure around, and I take the audience as the center point. So I usually do not work with actors, but I create a text and a soundscape that guides the audience's perspective through a place that they would normally walk through to run an errand or on their daily commute. So this is in downtown San Diego. This is in Union Station in LA. I created a sound walk in a produce market in Tbilisi, and this is sort of the bar space. I was part of a project with Rimini Protocol where people sit in the back of a truck and one side has been made into a window and they drive through the city, in this case, Dortmund, stopping at different sides and hearing a soundscape designed for these sites. And in the last few months during the pandemic, I created a work called You Are Here, which I performed from my home, which takes place in Google Earth. So the site is actually the virtual map of Google Earth. I also consider the place or the internet a place that represents our society and that has like certain politics to it. So I take the audience on a road trip through the virtual map of Google Earth. And I choose to set these performances in these places because they kind of ask the audience to reflect on how they would normally go about them.
Thank you, Marieke. Alvaro?
Yeah, well, just like everybody else, I want to thank you for the invitation and for allowing me to join the conversation. As Alex said in the introduction, I'm a research-based artist. So much like Jeremiah, a lot of my work starts with questions, and I do a lot of archival research to guide me in that direction. And oftentimes it takes me in directions that I wasn't really expecting, which I think is part of the interesting part of, for me, of my practice, is I don't go in with a set vision of what an art object should look like. I start with questions and I do archival research and readings and I see where that takes me. And I'm going to share my screen really quickly. I have a few images of some recent work. This is an installation that I did at Self-Help Graphics and Art called Geometries of Displacement. And in this piece, I'm really thinking about the long history of displacement in what we now call Los Angeles. I moved to Los Angeles in 2008 for grad school, and I saw the gentrification of Highland Park really firsthand, and I felt really complicit in that process. So that started me on a process of understanding what is the history of displacement as a modality of capitalist development. And in this installation, I use traditional printmaking and archival maps to make these transtemporal links. The very first map you see here is actually a map from 1769 of the Portola expedition, which depicted the Tongva peoples in what we now call the Los Angeles Basin. And for me, it's really important to situate displacement in this long-term context, because in order to understand gentrification or even something like redlining, I think it's really important to understand that these processes began with the displacement of indigenous peoples. And so the context of displacement in this city has a really long history. And in this piece, I start with these archival maps, such as this one from 1769, and I work through time. Here's a map from the 1850s showing what I envision as the initial privatization of land, right? And it begins this relationship to the natural environment, which has led to the Anthropocene, but which also begins with implanting these ideas of land as private property, which I think, to me, lies at the root of these issues of housing insecurity. We treat land like a commodity that can be traded for profit and for gain. And so what comes out of this? And I also incorporated this map from 1929. That's a homeowners loan corporation map of redlining in Los Angeles. Again, to show how this relationship to the land that we have creates racialized geographies. And I move through time. I use this map here in the installation from the I think it's the Urban Displacement Project. And it shows gentrification patterns in LA from 1990 to 2015. So I'm trying to make these linkages across time to demonstrate that displacement is not something new. It's actually a modality in sort of Western development and of the residues of colonialism. And in this most recent piece that I did with Self-Help Graphics, I was invited to do a piece that thought about the census count. And I wanted to think about sort of this paradoxical relationship about the invisibility of unhoused people, but the hypervisibility of the objects they use to survive harsh environments. Here's a little detail shot. And for me, you know, again, this history goes back to the arrival of the Spanish, in my understanding as a historian. And so this is how I approach my work as an artist. I really try to think about creating artwork that is not just about making a beautiful object, but which serves as a sort of social inquiry. For me, artists are also producing knowledge, but it just operates in a modality that is not necessarily legible if we think of the written word as a primary source of information.
Thank you, all of you. That was really, really great to get a window into everything you do. And Alvaro, I appreciate all of those maps. I think that's a perfect segue into actually diving into the topic because you've already done that. So housing insecurity, maybe more broadly, home, place, and identity is the topic we'd like to explore today. I would like to hear each of your thoughts on the role of the artist as a conduit between these issues and the broader public. More specifically, can you each reflect upon how your work calls attention to critical issues like housing insecurity and might offer new forms of communication? And Alvaro, you started to talk about that. Maybe you'd like to just continue?
Sure. I mean, like I said, I think for me, art has the capacity to communicate with people. You know, I come from a very working class immigrant background. My father finished the 5th grade back in Mexico. And so as an artist, I really try to think of how can I use the skill set that I have to communicate information in a way that is not reliant on the written word. That's sort of my investment in visual art. And for me, it has this capacity to reach at the affective center of these issues, right? It evokes emotions, it evokes feelings. And in my work, I try to implicate us in this settler colonial project. You know, I'm implicating myself as much as the viewer. So I think that art has this capacity to do things that I think exceed the capacity of say, a scholarly article. Not to bash on a scholarly article, I think it serves an important role, but I think that there's other modalities of communicating that information which can be just as effective in different registers.
Yes.
Sorry, were you gonna say something? I'll piggyback on that for 1 second. I think, by the way, the visuals that you both just showed us were all really fascinating. I think in my mind, I'm like, ooh, that could be cool to film in this way. I'll throw this in here. I don't want to do a screen share, but I will, just in case people want to know. The one documentary that we worked on, which was the first episode of City Rising, which deals specifically with gentrification and displacement, I will include in the chat. So if anybody wants to, they can check that out. There's that first episode now is a couple years old. The series is ongoing. But piggybacking on what Alvaro was saying, I think from my perspective, you know, when we talk about these issues and what art's role is in them, I think there are so many different ways that we can dive into that. So if I was going to start thinking more broadly, I think art's role kind of in the place, sort of, if we want to talk about this sort of intersectionality between, let's say, the commons and kind of the privatization of that public space, I think we're always talking about a degree of attention, what's grabbing, and obviously you put too much money in that, and that becomes marketing. If you put a certain amount of authority on it, and all of a sudden the power structure becomes a kind of a dynamic that's intrinsic to that the way that we're looking at that space. I think you're always going to be talking about holding up a mirror. There's always going to be some sort of emotion that we're talking about, which would hopefully relate to the current circumstance that we're looking at. And ultimately, what we would want to point towards, right, is some sort of level of transformation. Is that if the world that we want to see isn't fundamentally there, then how can we do something about that? At the risk of taking a small jump into a historical precedent, I think of when I was growing up, when I was going to college specifically, I studied a little bit on my own about the Situationist International and the kind of the French movement from the 60s, which maybe you've heard of a term called détournement. And this fundamentally gets at the idea of, it's kind of a precursor for graffiti in a way. And basically these people were lamenting the idea that the public space was no longer public, that everything was being hyper privatized, that we didn't really have a way to sort of say what we felt and engage in a meaningful conversation with our art. And one way of viewing that was, right, we're not going to wait for it, we're going to take it over. And détournement became about repurposing messages that were kind of in the public private space, which in ways that we might now think of as graffiti. So there's extremes, right? There's what's allowed and there's what's not allowed. And then there's this kind of legal precedent for what kind of takes place in the middle. But I think always when we talk about the role of art in kind of this public space, I think it's hard to talk about it without talking about the people who live in those spaces. And so, I mean, maybe that's a kind of a wide open way of looking at it. But I do think that, like, in a lot of ways, the types of images that we're using are going to reflect what our values are and what we bring into that environment, if that makes sense. So that would be like kind of broadly one weird amorphous way of looking at it. And I bring up graffiti only because I think, there's different, again, legal implications aside, there's this way of engaging with an urban environment that doesn't always ask for permission, but is every bit as arresting. And that can also be, transform itself into a sort of completely legal precedent, which is just say like printmaking or art that can be then redistributed and put out into the public sphere. But I think we're always looking at kind of what is this question about what are our values and how do we see ourselves ultimately? It would be like one big way of thinking about it.
Yes, I think that you both have said things that are very valuable. I also think that, that there's not one role that the arts can play. I think there's many ways to go about it. I feel that the two ways in which I'm dealing with it, I feel if I work in public space, what I'm really playing with is the perspective, the gaze literally of the audience members. I'm thinking of like, how can I direct the way that they look like as a camera? Because we all develop certain ways of moving around public space. We develop just habits and routines for ourselves. There's things that we ignore, there's things that we notice, and that's fine, that is human. We all do that. But when I create an experience in public space, I am actively trying to rewire and recategorize how you observe, what you observe, how fast or how slow you move through a space in order to sort of come to new observations. The other way that I would talk about it is that I feel that performance, but maybe art in general, it's a place where things are real and not real at the same time. And in that way, I think it's sort of a lab for society and also a space to explore alternatives. And so that's also how I look at my work. It's like, how can we create or rehearse or test ideas in a space that you can create rules that don't necessarily align with how society is currently operating. And so this space of potential, I think is very important for me in thinking about these issues, creating a space for potential futures or potential like alternative realities.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think that that's really a powerful statement, right? It's about imagining alternative possibilities, right? And I think that for me, especially in my practice now, I've done a lot of work on the past, but I'm interested more in sort of envisioning radical futures now, because I think, like Marika said, there's art has this potential to make rules that do not exist now, but it can help us imagine a liberatory future.
I also want to like go back what you said, Alvaro, about the sense of guilt. You know, like not in my practice, but as a artist person, of living in certain places. Like before I lived in LA, I lived in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam also has a housing crisis. It does not have as, you know, as many unhoused people as LA has, but housing is very expensive, very hard to find. And I've never had an actual like permanent lease in 10 years of living there. And one of the places, the place that I lived in before moving to LA was a neighborhood where the social housing corporations that were offering housing for very cheap to people, they were slowly evicting tenants for renovation. And before they could start a renovation, they had to fill those houses. You cannot have vacancy in Amsterdam. So I was looking for housing and I had the possibility to live there for like 300 euros a month. And I lived there for about 4 years. And it was the only housing I could get and could afford. I could be kicked out at any moment because they might renovate. But I was also, as an artist, very consciously used as a pawn of, you know, a sort of gentrifying the neighborhood. You put artists there, and if they want to live there, the rest will follow. So there is sort of this tension of like, this was the only housing that I could find or afford, but then also you become part of a larger system of displacement. And how do you deal with that?
Absolutely. I appreciate you making that connection, because I know in the work that I do with self-help graphics, you know, Bowl Heights is a community which is facing a lot of pressure to redevelopment. And there's been a lot of pushback against what they call art washing, right? Where the galleries come in, the artist comes in, and I see these memes. I really love meme culture. There's a meme that I saw circulating that as soon as you see an artist with a funky haircut in your neighborhood, you know rent is going to go up. And I think that there's a lot of truth in that. And I know for myself, in my experience in Highland Park, when I moved to Highland Park, it was a predominantly Latinx community. And I saw in a matter of 3 or 4 years that I was living there, how my next door neighbor, who was a single mother with 4 kids, got pushed out, and a white working, white collar family moved in next door. They revamped the whole property. And all of a sudden, the neighborhood shops disappeared. The mom and pop stores that were run by the Latinx community members were gone. And now you have shops that sell $5 donuts, which are obviously, that's not meant for the working class community. So I think that it's really important as artists to understand our implication in these processes. And I mean, I definitely felt guilt, but then I myself was then priced out of Highland Park because I don't have a high income. So it becomes really complicated, but I appreciate you making that connection, because I think it is a phenomenon that exists outside of just the US.
I appreciate both of you sharing your personal stories. It's quite clear to me that your own lives and how you've experienced cities makes its way very quite directly into your art. I think this might be a good time, Marika, to share your project, Biography of a Home, which is a very current project that is about a personal experience.
Yes, I'm currently I'm in the research phase of a project, Biography of a Home, and that basically emerged from having to fight for our own housing with my neighbors. I live in a duplex and there's a back unit, so there's 3 units total. When I moved in here 5 years ago, the home was owned by a speculation company in Georgia. A year or so later on, they sold it to a landlord who's also a construction developer who bought it with the intention to demolish the back unit and build new units. And I had no idea about like what our rights were as tenants. And I then began looking into it. I found out that they were saying to my neighbor in the back, they were like, we have permits to demolish it. They didn't have it. They sent in fake lawyers. Like I literally saw people putting on blazers and make fake lawyer cards. Like I couldn't find them in like the what is it, the Bar Association of California. And they were like, we're giving you this buyout offer. And so that's how I became actively involved. I found a lot of support through the LA Tenants Union, who helped us through this harassment. And, then it became clear to me that this is happening all over the town, that people are being forced out of their houses, that there are so many illegal evictions, there's illegal rent increases, and that there's this tension between, what is home for a tenant and what is a financial asset for someone else. And that is what I'm exploring in the biography of a home. So when this happened to us, I was like, how often has this happened with this house, and what is the history of this house? And then I started researching who has lived here in the past 100 years. So I basically made a list of all the inhabitants, but also on the block. Actually, the Inner City Art Center used to be on the block where I lived, and that is not here anymore. It's sort of an apartment complex. There is like nothing that remembers the rich history of that cultural institution anymore. And I did a lot of archival research into how this house came to be, who has lived here. I found advertisements that the house was for rent from 1916. But I also spent a lot of time looking at newspapers from like the late 19th century, and going back to something that was mentioned before, like real estate speculation is basically in the DNA of this city, sort of the promise of being able to purchase a property is like, that's what LA was built on. Like there was nothing here, or there was a small indigenous village here, but people on the East Coast were told that, you could live here like you could live in Spain. And so this, sort of this real estate promise is at the heart or at the core of LA as we know it now, and it hasn't stopped. Like if you look at newspapers from the 1890s, like there's basically 2 kinds of articles. Like there's gun shootings, and who bought which lot for how much money. Like that's basically all that is reported. And so it's sort of, it's in a way how this city has constantly perpetuated themselves. And my project is looking at, like, through this lens of the one house that I live in, how that basically has manifested in different ways throughout the course of over a century.
I find that fascinating that your research began with just a single house, but then through that digging into the history, it led to so many larger revelations about Los Angeles. Maybe we could jump to Jeremiah on that note. You have dealt with eviction in some of your films, I understand.
Yeah. So just to give a brief background, one of the things we were tasked with doing when we came on to do City Rising was we were tasked with looking at gentrification and displacement, pretty broadly, from 6 different places largely across Southern California, but partially also in East Oakland and Sacramento, but the rest was in Santa Ana, Sacramento, Boyle Heights as well, and South Central, and then Long Beach. So the series it was broken up into episodes and was also released as a 1-hour documentary, deals with those issues from a variety of perspectives. It's looking at it from the role of city planners, developers, from activists, from housing activists, from land trust perspective, from people that are working specifically with affordable housing, and then all the way down to people who are just housing burdened, and people that were susceptible to, and ultimately in certain cases being kicked out of their homes. One thing I didn't realize over the course of making the film was that somebody had told us that if you spend more than 1/3 of your income on your house or on rent, that you're housing burdened. And I was like, oh snap, we're housing burdened. Like, I had no clue that we fell into that category too. And I mean, there were a million things that we learned, because we obviously were the film also deals with what you would call experts, so a more traditional kind of talking head approach to some of the data, and the California endowment was a big part of that. So one of the things that shocked me that I'll regurgitate back to you now came from a guy named Anthony Iton, Iton, if I'm saying his last name right, who he told us very early when we went to interview him, because the beginning of the film deals with racial covenants, so we also use the same map that Alvaro showed us in the very beginning of Los Angeles. And he said something that stuck with me. He said, tell me your zip code and I'll tell you how long you have to live. And I kind of thought that this was like a dramatic thing to say, which it is, but it was completely serious. And you start to look at these racial covenants, and you start to look at how areas were redlined, and in some cases, then you're broken up into like cuts of beef, as he put it, into red and yellow and green areas, which were considered more or less desirable. Many of you are probably familiar with this because we're already here, so I won't go into the details there. But what surprised me was that those areas that had been categorically and racially divested in had a complete parallel way of looking at mortality rates, and they were not insignificant. They were about 10 to 20 years of less average life expectancy in areas that were red versus areas that were green. And I was like, my goodness, and it makes sense. But what we're talking about now is today. We're not, so these areas that had been historically divested in, let's say about 100 years ago, and continue to be divested in for that period of time. Now, granted, part of what our series also covers was what we're all particularly probably aware of now, which is the return to cities, which essentially was the opposite of when we had divested in urban cores in America, right? And everybody got out, and that was when we started to say, you know what, let's let the urban cores of our the cities in this country, maybe we don't need to spend money investing in those areas, until, of course, wealthier individuals wanted to move back into them decades later. So getting back to the idea, it's a bit of a digression, but getting back into the idea that how did our work kind of deal with people who were experiencing being housing burdened and potentially housing insecurity at large. What we found was that it wasn't just what the obvious things that you might consider would be, that we in fact were housing burdened, and that we also went through a period of during the process of making the film where our landlord was extorting us for saying, I don't want to make these adjustments on your house, I'll just raise the rent. And at the same time, we're seeing slum landlords doing these types of illegal tactics to tenants in Long Beach, basically threatening people to kick them out if they, didn't want to, if they wanted to report these things. And so you start to, for me, and somewhat selfishly in a way, this gets back to what I was saying earlier about documentary film, is that I am curious about people as a starting point, and then through presenting and understanding this sort of, I guess what you would say is it's just a friendship. I mean, I don't have a film if I don't have a relationship with the people who are in it. I can't expect it to help co-tell their story if I don't have that relationship established, and nor should I. I mean, and nor should I have any right to do it. But in every instance, it's always a learning experience too. So for me, on a selfish level, I'm like, well, this is also expanding my own world, because now I'm growing and I'm saying, okay, gosh, I didn't realize the depth to this, right? So, but yes, we did film with a woman named Araceli, who was a promotora in Santa Ana, and just this really wonderful, sweet woman. And we essentially just followed her and her family as they were basically going through the process of getting kicked out of their house and trying to find another place to live. And it was incredibly difficult to watch, because there wasn't a whole lot we could do about it other than be there and spend time with each other and, kind of have meals together and stuff. They ultimately were rehoused, but it was just a long, difficult process. And it's just unfortunately all too common. So I'll stop there, but there's plenty of other things I can say about the series and the experience.
Thank you. I think what all of you are illuminating seems to be the importance of asking questions, the importance of going deeper into issues rather than just taking words or data for face value, really questioning what's out there. And you touched on it earlier, that seems to be the value that artists bring to issues such as this. So I'd like to maybe ask you to think about you as artists, and here you are invited by an Institute for Ethics and Policy. Do you see any interface between you as an artist and some of these more institutional structures that exist, and whether, possibly could there be more partnership between artists and these entities?
I'll just say this, since I was just speaking, like one thought that does occur to me is that if the arts, if we as artists, and as other people, I would say, people at large, if we don't find ways to plug arts into these institutional types of conversations, if we want to keep them separate, we're in for a lot more hurt. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but I would go back to one thing that Alvaro said earlier, which I think particularly applied to our film, which is just that, how did you put it? You said, we have to get out of being like purely academic. No, it wasn't what you said. You said that art needs to exceed the scholarly article. And I think that that's a really important point to make for reasons that I hope ties into your question, which is just that it was certainly a problem that we had in researching for the film, because here we are, we're talking about all of these different modalities of all of these different things. Any one of them, any one person's story could have been a 5-part documentary series, but instead we're trying to smash them all together and deal with all these different places, which is great because, it's a challenge. And hopefully if you do it right, then you can watch, an hour of something and get a better idea of what the intersectionality is, how these parts, how these stories all relate to one another. But one thing I love, but also the danger of preparing to make a film, is that you do have to get a little scholarly. So we co-produced the film with CCEP. KCET is a mainstay, in Southern California, recently joined back up with public broadcasting after many years of doing their own thing. But it's very rooted in the research. And so we had a team of people in addition to ourselves who were just constantly coming through articles, constantly looking for case studies, looking for different people to talk to. And that's what you have to do. I mean, the research is at least in this field and in a documentary that's going to cover some facts about ultimately about an important issue. You have to do it, but it's very easy to get lost in it, and it's very easy for that to become kind of stale, and it's very easy for that, were it to stay on the page, to become the kind of thing that people say, let's just leave that for the experts, you know, when really these are issues that affect all of us. And how they are synthesized and how they are brought back down into a palatable way of exchange in terms of what that information is trying to convey is incredibly important. I just don't know how else to put it. If we aren't excited, and that feels like a weird word to use in this context, but I would say excitability in terms of frustration, passion, fear, rage. Those are the types of things that any important issue should elicit within us. And art is fundamentally related into translating those and eliciting those types of responses in terms of where we would also otherwise maybe be in fear of letting things become too academic. And I say that obviously with all great love for, you know, academia. I grew up, both of my parents are teachers. I love being able to come at things from an academic perspective, but I also understand that what we are talking about at a certain level is accessibility. And I believe that you have to catch people. And sometimes that's where the artist comes in. You know, it's like, how are you catching people? And sometimes it's through a print or a meme even that highlights a crazy, you know, a contradiction that is either funny or sad or terrifying. And then that's where we have to start the conversation. And that's where we jump in. If you lose that, I think you really run the risk of institutions continuing to, or moving further in a direction of not reflecting the values that we should be, you know, basically upholding ultimately. I hope that answered your question. Sorry if I rambled.
No, I mean, I think you brought up some important points, Jeremiah. I mean, for me, I mean, I have a symbiotic relationship with academics, right? Like I rely on academics doing the labor, performing the labor that they do in order to be able to inform the work that I do. So my comment wasn't meant to downplay or minimize the importance of that labor. I think that there's, you know, at least in my understanding of political movements and political economy, you know, these broad coalitions are really important. And I think that none of us operates in a silo, right? What these institutions do and do well is very important. And at the same time, I think that at least specifically regarding to culture production and artistic work, we just have a different set of skills that we can bring to the conversation that help to augment the work that's being done by the institutions. And I think that it goes back to what Jeremiah was saying about really thinking really broadly about how social change happens. And I can't, you know, artists cannot operate in a silo. You know, we're members of the community too. I see myself as a member of my community. And the relationships that I could have with institutions who are working towards this change, I think are integral to broader social movements.
I just want to follow up one thing, but really quickly, which is that, yeah, I didn't want to misconstrue what you were saying earlier. I just thought it was, so I think your point is well taken and what you were mentioning there. I brought it up within this context because at least for me personally, when making a film that deals with a historical precedent, there's a certain amount of information. You do have to have a two-way channel going on. With how that information is being received and processed and then ultimately regurgitated and put back out into the world. The danger is, or maybe not the danger, but the challenge is, and I think one of the things as a creator, doesn't matter what you're doing, I think you have to ask yourself before you start, okay, I want to engage with this topic. I have an idea. Is it a film? Is it a movie? I have to ask myself that anyway. And so, you know, it might not be a film. It might be an article. You know, it might be something that literally should be written, and there might be reasons for that. Or, you know what? It might be, hey, you know, this idea maybe is better suited for a podcast, a serial podcast, which I know that some of you may be working on. All of those different mediums are going to give you different opportunities. And ultimately, I think some of the material that you're working on will dictate what medium you end up in. So I say that because it would have been very easy for us to turn A City Rising into a book. I mean, if we had gone real hard in one direction, you just make a book. It's just, there's just too much information, and we ran into that problem on the first episode, really the first 15 minutes ultimately of the film, which becomes about the 250 years of racist housing policy and everything. If you really want to do that justice, you have to go even further back, as Alvaro had mentioned earlier. At a certain point, what you're talking about is you're also acknowledging that what you're leaving things out. There are things that are not being included that are equally as important. And so the medium and what you're trying to communicate become very, very important. That's all I would add. Yeah.
There's starting to be some questions in the chat, and I'm seeing one that I think would be a good follow-up to this conversation about academia and art. Someone is asking about whether you see your work as ethnographic work that can connect both academia and real life. And I would ask Marika, maybe you could speak to that, since you work very directly with people in your performances.
Sure. Yeah, and I think what I say also has to do with, or what I want to say about it also has to do with what we just discussed. For me, being an artist or doing things at theaters or in festivals or being in academia is not enough. And for me, there is really there is really distinction between how my brain operates when I'm creating an artwork or if I'm doing my organizing work with the LA Tenants Union. And I think actually that for what we're discussing today, what I'm doing with the LA Tenants Union is way more important than the performance that I'm gonna make about my house. You know, I think especially in the last year, there's been an increase of illegal evictions, and you know, what we do with the South LA local is eviction blockades, or we write letters to landlords, or you know, we advocate on behalf of tenants, help them stay longer in their home and make them aware of their rights. I think someone was asking also, it's like, you know, what can you do if you feel that eviction is coming? So the first thing is know your rights, and if you don't know them, like find a group like the LA Tenants Union, or there were some other organization posted that can help you make them aware of them, and organize with your neighbors, because the moment that you're organized, you're stronger. And for me, it's like, you know, that is really like the work that I do with the LA Tenants Union is really a realm of like action, where I don't think like, what does it mean? Where's the nuance? Because it's not relevant. Like, people are being kicked out of their homes, and you know, you have no time to think about the larger context of the history. And there is a tension for me because it's like, it's a very different aspect, you know, it's a very different way of operating when I dive into the archives and look at old newspapers about, you know, the city 100 years ago. I think maybe personally what I can offer is that I operate in both spaces and can foster a dialogue between them. But I think in reality, they're very far apart and they have very different needs too. And yeah, what I'm trying to be is like sort of a bridge, or you know, trying to make the distance a little bit smaller.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that kind of tension. I think that speaks to you know, a reason why it's actually difficult for these worlds to come together, even if we would like them to. You're just operating in a very different space. But I am curious about how you said that you feel that your work with the tenants' rights group is more important than your art. So in a way, downplaying the art because perhaps that work feels like it's like solving problems in a very direct way, whereas the art is there, but maybe slightly, it's not solving problems, but it's doing
Yeah.
something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think it's like less important when it comes to like what can I actively do for this issue. Like I think what I can actively do for housing is injustice is, you know, more on the ground work than making a performance about it. But that doesn't, you know, I still think it is important that there is a debate, and that it is a topic that is represented in art, and that we, you know, that it is part of the cultural discourse. So I'm not saying that it's not unimportant, but if, you know, if I'm looking back at what has the most like immediate effect, or like what makes the most difference in the end, I think it's really showing up for people's houses on days that they're being evicted, or writing a landlord that the rent increase that they did was illegal, because it can make the difference of people sleeping in their bed at night or not. And that's something very concrete. And I think when I make performances, I'm in sort of a more nuanced and reflective space that is also necessary. But there is such urgency with the issues that we're talking about that sometimes I feel we don't really have the luxury of like remaining in that reflective, contemplative, nuanced, observational space.
That makes a lot of sense. I think time has a lot to do with it when you talk about urgency. Art kind of operates at quite a slow pace. It's reflective and contemplative, but sometimes when there's something that rises to the top, you just can't ignore it. I wonder if Brady, if I don't know if you're monitoring the chat. I haven't scrolled through all the questions, but do you see any, since we have about 15 minutes left? It would be good to address some of these.
Yeah, so I would say what's interesting is a little bit of what's going on in the chat is some mutual aid, and that people are asking questions about what to do if you're under threat of being evicted, which I think speaks to what Marike is talking about, is that there's some attendees to the discussion that themselves are dealing with some of those immediate issues. I think, you know, a question that Jonathan posed in the chat that I'll kind of rephrase as being one about perhaps the tension of artists and policymakers, or anyone that's trying to help advocate or create change. Is there a risk that they can also do harm? And I'm wondering how that kind of relates to what the panelists were speaking about earlier, about having themselves felt complicit in some ways in the past. And so maybe that's a question to revisit, is how do you think about that tension of trying to be an ally or trying to be an advocate, while also reflecting on your own role, your own impact. So I think that's what I'm seeing in the chat. But please, Rennie, we have someone say both gentrifiers and gentrified, right? As I think Alvaro had mentioned. So
Yeah, I mean, I think that question to me, I think it's context specific, right? I think that in certain instances, I think there's I wouldn't see it necessarily as harm, but there's maybe, I mean, I want to go back to Marika was saying, in terms of the urgency of certain things, I think that on a discursive level, artistic work is important, but I also push myself to actually be involved in direct efforts to mutual aid. And one of the beautiful things about printmaking is that you can print a bunch of stuff and try to sell it at an affordable price and raise money for mutual aid efforts. That's one of the things that I do. I work with some mutual aid organizations to really bring relief to people who need tents, right? Like that's such a ubiquitous thing that we see in Los Angeles now. And it's, in my mind, I don't know if I'm doing more harm than good, because in a way I am putting another Band-Aid on the problem, right? By giving people tents. But at the same time, I think of it as harm reduction. If I can keep somebody from having to sleep in the elements, and my selling, $600, $700 worth of prints gets people at least to have some shelter, even if it's imperfect, then I feel that that serves an immediate purpose that's much more urgent than the discursive implications of, say, creating this contemplative work. So I mean, I think that the question is a good one, but I think it really depends on the context, right? And I think that, as Marika was saying, there are more immediate urgent concerns that can be taken care of through direct action. And I don't think that art is always necessarily that removed. I think that there's a lot of artists who do, especially artists who work in public practice and social practice. Oftentimes it's real direct interventions. Right now I'm doing a project with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, and they work specifically to counter evictions in, say, places like the Bay Area, Los Angeles, New York City. So I think that there is a place in the arts for direct advocacy that is not necessarily going to reproduce the harm done to people facing housing insecurity. It just takes really concrete thinking about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and in what context you're performing that labor.
I think also, like, adding to that, and I'm not a visual artist, but I think that especially visual arts can help with creating a sense of visibility. Like in the neighborhood that I live, housing injustice is just obvious from the moment that you step on the sidewalk, but that's not true for all parts of Los Angeles. So there is, I think art can help make, can make visible the scope of some of the issues that that we are talking about.
Yeah, that brings to mind, I think I think it was the artist David Hammond who did the show at Hauser and Wirth. I have mixed feelings about the intervention. I have actually a lot of mixed feelings because it's a blue chip gallery. But I see that the impulse of the artist was to make visible, right, the human experience of being on the streets. I think the limitation was that it took place in a blue chip gallery and in a space where the unhoused are not welcome, right? And so there's a lot of ethical implications in these, and I think there's no real easy answer. The same way that somebody phrased it as, I'm both a gentrifier and gentrified. It takes a lot of nuance to understand that, but I think that there is a certain form of visibility. And I appreciate what Jeremiah was saying earlier about actually working with people, right? I think one of the limitations that I can acknowledge in my own work is that kind of to answer this question about ethnography, my work is not ethnographic. It's thinking about structures and history. But I think that different media have different affordances. And something like film, for instance, documentary film in particular, has that potential to show a visibility of the stories from the people being affected in a way that I can't necessarily do as a printmaker, or that I don't do for various reasons.
Yeah, that actually goes back to my first question about medium, that we actually need a multiple of media. It can't just be the academic paper or just a film or just a book. We need people to also, lead people around the city as Marika does, or we need visuals to draw attention to things. So I think that multiplicity is really key. Should we address one more question in the last 5 minutes, or what do you think, Brady?
Yeah, we've got, I think, a nice question to close on perhaps a somewhat optimistic note. But Alex asks, what advice do you have for budding artists and storytellers And maybe I'll just add to that, what advice do you have in the context of what we're talking about, right? This tension between artists trying to be advocates and being members of a community as well. But I think that's a great final question.
I mean, to build on my last response, I mean, something that I tell my students, because I teach, I've lived many lives. I teach US history, I teach art. And what I always tell my students is to think about their relationship to structures of power, right? Like, I think that is a fundamental thing. As creators, as human beings, it's not just for artists, it's really think about your relationship to structures of power and where are you on these power dynamics. And I think that sort of either compels you to do something about it or at least face with a little bit of discomfort your relative privilege. And so then what are you going to do with that privilege? I think that to me is an advice that I would give to people working in multiple realms.
I'll, at the risk of maybe saying something that goes a little bit off the rails, this quote from Tarkovsky comes to mind, and he's kind of talking about the role of the artist. And so let me just try to mention this, and then let's see where this goes. But this is from kind of I think it's just his journals that were published later in his life. But basically, he goes, "The artist is always the servant and is perpetually trying to pay for the gift that has been given to him as if by a miracle. Modern man, however, does not want to make any sacrifice, even though true affirmation of the self can only be expressed through sacrifice. All of us today are infected with an extraordinary egoism, and that is not freedom. Freedom means learning to demand only of oneself, not of life, not of others, and knowing how to give, sacrifice in the name of love. It is obvious that art cannot teach anyone anything, since in 4,000 years, humanity has learned nothing at all. The aim of art is to prepare a person for death and to plow and harrow his soul, rendering it capable of turning to good." So that's kind of a metal last line. But what I like about it, though, is that I think that it ties back into the idea about power. I don't think you can walk into a place and say, I've got it figured out and I'm just going to do it. And then here it is. And I think you always have to be mindful of what you're bringing into a circumstance. There's all of these things that, we each have as different individuals in different contexts that are going to shift. And I think what my understanding about those words and the way that I try to think about myself in a creative space, which I would double as the real world, there's always a creative opportunity in any exchange, always relies on being present and not thinking what the situation is. I don't think you can ever, the moment you do that, you've shut yourself off to everything and there's no room for growth. So I think really the advice that I would give is lead with passion, lead with curiosity, lead with kind of a humble respect for everything around you, because honestly, like if it's really about it does have to do with the expectation and to remove kind of your own ideas so that you can engage with the world and with whoever's in front of you or whatever subject matter it is that you're trying to learn about or express something about in a way that can maximize both your own ability for personal growth, but your actual what you're setting out to do, which is to hopefully to make art that has some meaning, right? And so I think you can't do that without being open, without trying your best to be open. We're obviously going to fail. We're human, but I find it's easiest to do that when you're passionate, because that's the thing that's going to draw you back into it. So find those things that keep you excited and that keep you grounded and keep you going.
Yeah, I think I'm going to say something that has been said, but then in different words. But I just want to echo what Alvaro and Jeremiah said. I think what I have learned, what I didn't know, or what I didn't realize when I was a younger artist, is the necessity if there's a question you're exploring or whatever the inquiry is that you're doing, that you really have to look at that inquiry also within yourself, that it cannot only just be the, you know, it's not the work, it's also, if that's a question that you're asking, what does that really mean for you? And what is, you know, what is your position in that? Or like, how do you operate in the whatever system or whatever question it is that you're looking at? So I think it is about daring to put yourself at stake. And I think that who I am as a citizen and who I am as an artist like started to conflate more and more, where they were more separate in the beginning, but now I feel that I'm sort of approaching both these elements of my identity in the same way. So yeah, I think it's about really asking yourself the questions that you're also asking in the work.
Thank you so much. I think that's those are really great pieces of advice. And this discussion has been extremely rich and has left us all with a lot to think about. Thank you. And thank you to the audience. Thank you to all my landscape students who are here, and to Alex, Brady, Corwin, and Michael for organizing this.
Thanks everyone for coming. Please put your virtual hands together to thank our wonderful panelists and Dr. Tang for this really, truly amazing discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Tang.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you, panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks for the great moderation, Rennie.
Yeah, thanks, Rennie. Appreciate it.
Yeah, that was
Bye.
great. Thank you so much.